Chapter 7, May 28th. Danny Kim totally lost in the library today. It was right after lunch. He came in wearing those plastic glasses with giant bloodshot eyeballs that hung out on springs. With this crazy laugh, he jumped up on a table. Then, leaping from one table to the next, he attempted to make these sorry attempts to crack jokes, saying stuff like, "Nice ring, let me have a closer look," and "Here's looking at you, kid." This was Mr. 99.9% Danny, Mr. Class President for the last 3 years, Mr. Winner of the Debate Club, acting so bizarre. It was pathetic. The major problem here is you don't talk to our school you don't talk in our school library. You don't eat, drink, turn pages, or push out chairs too noisily in our library. Whispering is pounced on, and giggling is practically a capital offense. So when Mrs. Zimmerman, the librarian, came walking back out of the back room, pushing a cart of books, and Danny was standing on our table laughing stupidly, and we were trying to tell him to get a grip, she went ballistic. "Danny Kim, just what do you think you're doing?" "Hey, Mrs. Zed, want to dance?" Danny did a little jig on our table. "I've got my party eyes on." "Get down. I want to speak to you right now. And that goes for everyone at your table." Joanne, Mandeep, Linda Yep, and I looked at one another. We started to protest, but we weren't doing any now. By Mrs. Zed's hostile tone, it was apparent we didn't have a hope. So, following Danny, we filed quietly into her office. She closed the door behind us. For several moments, she didn't say a thing. She just stood there with her arms folded and this real intense look on her face. She stuck an upturned hand toward Danny. He gave her the glasses. "Now, what is the meaning of all this?" Danny's face lost all trace of humor. It was now the reverse. He looked so sad and so lost, I thought he was going to cry. "I was just trying to have some fun," he told her. Mrs. Zed adjusted her glasses and glowered at Danny, at Joanne, at Mandeep, at Linda, and at me. "Trying to have some fun," she repeated dryly. "Yes," Danny practically whimpered. "I guess it's not allowed." Mrs. Zed pressed her lips together, forming a hard white line. She unfolded her arms and planted them on her hips. "Well, Mr. Kim, you guessed right. That kind of fun," she sucked the word like it had a sour taste, "is not allowed. The library is a place for quiet study and intellectual enjoyment. It's not a place for twisted entertainment." "I know, but you don't understand." "What is it about what I have just said that you don't understand?" "I wasn't trying." "Mr. Kim, if you were a weak student studying for an exam that could make the difference between passing and failing the year, and you were prevented by doing so by the inappropriate behavior of one very loud student, what would you call that?" Danny lifted his eyes from the floor. He looked helplessly over at me. I mouthed the word rude. "What was that?" "Rude?" whispered Danny. "Rude indeed. Not to mention inconsiderate and disrespectful. Would you be tolerant of a student like that?" "I guess not." "What was that?" "No." "You wouldn't?" "No." Dandy's thunderous response compelled Mrs. Zed to silence, but it was only temporary. "Of course you wouldn't." With these needle eyes, she slowly studied each one of our faces. "Now I hope I have helped you all understand we have rules for a reason. They were not drawn up simply to amuse me and Mrs. Lofts. You must also understand that when a student behavior is inconsistent with these rules, action must be taken. By doing so, we are attempting to teach you responsibility. Responsibility to yourself and to those around you. With that in mind, you are all suspended from the library for 1 week." With this shocked expression, Danny looked up from the floor and at all of us. "But Mrs. Zed, it had nothing to do with them." "Shh, Danny, shh." Holding my finger to my lips, I shook my head. "Never mind, she'll really blow." "Mr. Kim, as far as I'm concerned, it had everything to do with them. An enthusiastic audience is as much part of the play as the actor. Now, all of you, off to your next class." I was right. She blew. We all slunk out. You might think we'd be mad at Danny, but we weren't. We felt sorry for him. We knew why he did it. Something Mrs. Zed didn't know, or if she did, she didn't care. We knew his brother Wilson had run away from home. Wilson was 17, 3 years older than Danny. He'd been to school off and on through junior high, but since he turned 16, not at all. Wilson had done some pretty manic things in his lifetime, like fed the hose through their neighbor's window when they were gone for a weekend and turned it on, set his bedroom on fire when he was mad at his mom, tied Danny to a tree in the canyon because he did so well in school, and left him there, crashed Darla Miller's party and annihilated her dad's wine collection. Now he was charged with assault and theft, which was the reason he had run away. Wilson and a friend had knocked 2 kids to the ground, roughed them up, and stolen their bikes. The police found the mangled frames 4 days later in the Capliano River. Danny's parents fretted day and night over Wilson. First, it was maybe if they put him in basketball, he'd get along better with the other kids. Then, maybe if he went to private school, he'd get better marks. Maybe if they brought him designer clothes, he would have more self esteem. Maybe if they bought him a computer, he'd develop an interest. Maybe a car would get him away from his friends in Lynn Valley. Maybe if they took him to Paris, the cat poisoning incident would blow over. Maybe, maybe, maybe. Yes, Danny? Oh, 99.9% is good. Very good, dear. But what about your brother, Willie? Maybe if we take him to Bishop's for his birthday, just the three of us, he'd appreciate what we do for him. Your birthday, Danny? Oh, sure, you can have a couple of kids over for pizza, but we'll be going out. Danny couldn't compete. No matter what he did, or how well he did it, Wilson always had one up on him. All Danny really wanted was to be noticed. Today, Mrs. Zed noticed him. I was making hamburger helper for Dad and me when he got the call. I knew it was Mrs. Zed because Dad said hello and then was quiet while he looked over at me, frowning. He continued frowning in silence for some time. Thank you for calling, Mrs. Zimmerman. It will be dealt with, was all he said. Dealt with? What's there to deal with? Dad, look, I can explain, I said, before Dad even hung up. Danny snapped, and we were just trying to calm him down. By disturbing everyone in the library? By preventing the serious students from getting their work done? Don't you think that's a little bit rude? I said, jumping right in. Yes, definitely. It'd be rude, inconsiderate, and disrespectful, if it were the case. But like I said, we were only trying to help Downey. Couldn't you have picked a more thoughtful way, for instance, one in keeping with library rules? I knew Dad wasn't really as mad as he was pretending. Mrs. Zed had got him all hyped up. She made him believe it was his parental duty to harass me. I also knew what Dad really thought of people like Mrs. Zed. By the book, no exceptions. No time to listen to excuses. I'd seen Dad's picture from high school. Just his long hair told me he wasn't exactly the conformist type. I couldn't help just a tiny smile. Dad tried to disguise his own. What do you mean, Danny snapped. So I told him about Wilson's latest crime, about what an embarrassment he is to Danny, how at home Danny is always ignored in favor of Wilson, how unfair it is that I wish Wilson would never come back. Dad agreed that it wasn't fair, but then life often isn't fair, something I've heard him say mega times before. You can't change the world, Pam. All you can do is offer Danny your support. Lifting 2 plates from the cupboard, I spooned out the hamburger helper. Still, Dad said as I set it before him, I can't let this go unnoticed. I told her I'd deal with it. We thought about this when we ate. You could ground me, I suggested. Okay, how about Sunday night? That still leaves your weekend open. Thoughtful of him. But aren't we going to Nana's Sunday night? Oh, right. I forgot. Monday then. I considered it. Yeah, I can't see why not. Good. Monday it is. Dad seemed relieved. We finished our supper. Dad stretched as he stood up. And since we'll be at home, why don't you ask Danny for dinner? Okay. And maybe Mandeep? Dad nodded. Chapter 8. May 29th. Danielle Higgins is lucky she's got a perfect body, because other than that, she's nothing but a creep. She is rude, she's insulting, and if there's something she wants, she'll crush and grind anybody that gets in her way. That includes our teachers. It's like she doesn't have a conscience. Like, she figures the whole world is hers for the taking, and all the rest of us should serve it up to her on our bended knees. If we refuse, well, we just better watch out. I guess I'm lucky. She's never made me a target. She's always looked right past me or through me. I've never been any kind of threat. Like, no duh. Not that she has to have a particular thing against you. Sometimes she'll pick on you for no reason. Usually it's just because she's bored. It's been Danny Kim this week. Nothing too direct, just these nasty little digs, like when Wally gave us all a math sheet, then left the room for a few minutes this morning. Danielle took one look at it and made this spluttery sound with her lips. No doubt it was a bit beyond her. Bored, needing entertainment, she began to look around, chomping her gun, slapping her pencil eraser against the desk. Her eyes fell on Danny. Hey, Danny. Danny, who was already half finished, looked up through a blur. Huh? Is your dad out of work? He blinked. What? No? Why are you asking me that? Just wondering. Danielle shrugged. She was pretending to rediscover her worksheet. Why did you ask me that? Pretty well. The entire class is looking at her now. We all wanted to know. Danielle didn't look up. Oh, just the fact that your family couldn't afford a new bike for your brother made me think money in the Kim house might be tight. If it had been anyone else who had said it, nobody would have laughed. But because it was Danielle, half the class, all boys, did laugh. It was beside the point whether they thought it was funny or not. It was the sexy Danielle who had spoken. I could see Danny wanted to club her, but he's far too dignified for that. He went back to his worksheet. Danielle also plays teachers against one another, like when she's trying to bump up a mark, like when she barely made sense in her social studies essay and brought it to the attention of Mr. Overhand. But Mr. O, I don't understand, a flutter of her lashes. On my last English essay, I got 95%. Mr. Bartell wrote comments like fresh and distinctive. I was only trying to refine my style. So, guess what? Smitten with self doubt, Mr. O bumped her up 15%. Then there was this time she was just plain mean to Mrs. Lazarenko, our amazingly obese music teacher who conducts the choir from a chair. Danielle was so determined that for one cause she was going to make her stand up, so she spread tax points up on her chair. Mrs. Lorenzo came waddling in as usual, opened a music book on the piano, stuck a note, repeated it in voice, and as we waited for a reaction, settled onto her chair. There was no reaction. All right, class, California Dreamin' once through, beginning now, and she bellowed the first few words. Our mouths hung open, but no sound came out. She stopped short. Are you with me, class, or is it up to me to give a solo performance? She wriggled to sit up. The white flesh hanging from her arms rippled with the effort. She began the song again. Still, our mouths hung open. Come on, come on. One by one, we sort of joined in, but that we were all more or less singing when the song came to an end. That was terrible, just terrible. Let's try to put a little bit pizzazz in it. Come on, Joanne, Darla, heads up, Pamela, Mandeep, Danielle, look sharp. Mrs. Lazarenko sat on those tacks for the entire music class. When the bell went, she stood up. She shuffled back to the piano to collect her music books, and there were the tacks embedded in her great wide butt. She bent to pick up her music. She knocked it to the floor. With great effort, she bent all the way down. One by one, like little bits of ammunition, those tacks sprang out. Mrs. Lazarenko must have been wearing one major girdle, like large enough to cover the state of Montana. Ping, ping, ping. We took off out the classroom to avoid being struck. One of Danielle's worst stunts was what she did to Joanne. Joanne didn't tell me the whole story until yesterday, but that was the reason Joanne returned to uncool. This all happened last December. Joanne's parents had been friends with their neighbors, the Adlers, forever it seemed. Joanne's mom and Mrs. Adler were leaders of our Girl Guide troop and played tennis in the park. Mr. Robertson and Mr. Adler helped each other in their yards in the summer. On Saturdays, they'd carry lumber or fix fences, or sometimes just sit out on the front lawn in lawn chairs and share a beer together. At the beginning of May, since I can remember, the Adlers and Robertsons organized a barbecue for the entire block. I always got to stay overnight at Joanne's when it happened. We'd eat Maui ribs and blintzes stuffed with cheese until we looked like them. We'd dance in the street until long after dark, then we'd all roast marshmallows in the Adlers' backyard. The thing I haven't mentioned yet is that the Adlers have a son. His name is Steve and he's 16. He was and is really, really good looking. Picture Leonardo DiCaprio with black hair. Anyways, Joanne and I have been drooling over him for quite a long time. Hey, he was so far out of our reach, it was allowed. We've always just been noisy little kids to him. Oh, and for this to make sense, you have to know that the Adlers are Jewish. So what happened is last November, when Joanne was cool, she went to this party with Danielle. There was a bunch of people from senior high. And who should she meet there but her neighbor, Steve Adler? He didn't even recognize Joanne at first. Not now that she had turned 14, not in all her cool grown-up state. But as Joanne said, he must have liked what he saw because he hung around her most of the evening. He called the next day. They went to a movie together and for a bite to eat at the mall. Everything was going real smooth between them until Danielle stepped in. The problem was Danielle also had this thing for Steve going on, but instead of saying anything to Joanne, she handled it in her own distinctive way. Joanne discovered what Danielle had done when she was helping out her dad put up the Christmas lights a month later. She was in the garage getting Mr. Robertson the extra light bulbs. Mr. Robertson was carrying the ladder to the front of the house. That's when Mrs. Adler came over to talk to him. Joanne watched her cross the driveway through the garage window. Sensing some kind of weird tension in the way that Mrs. Adler walked, Joanne stayed right where she was. She just listened through the open side door. She told me the conversation went something like this. Hi, Debbie, her dad said. He added something about it being so sunny and warm and how he could easily get used to weather like that in December. I want to talk to you, Joanne imitated Mrs. Adler in this very grave voice. We've heard something from one of your daughter's classmates. Then there was this very long pause. We, Ben and I, know you and Susan well. At least we thought we did. And we hope what we've heard isn't true. Oh? Mrs. Adler had Mr. Robertson's attention. And what's that? Your daughter, you and your family, have something against Jews? What? Joanne said her dad practically yelped. He'd heard a clatter like the ladder had fallen onto the ground. Where did you hear such a thing? Debbie, we've known each other such a long time. I'd like to think you know us better than that. Joanne figured that by the silence that followed, it didn't matter how long they had known each other, or how well. I only know what I've heard. The things this young lady heard from Joanne are vicious. They must have come from somewhere. If our friendship has meant anything, I trust you'll put a stop to it. This is ridiculous, Joanne's dad continued in disbelief. Susan and I have always emphasized respect and tolerance in raising our children. Who said such things? Come on, Debbie, don't believe some rumor when you know it isn't true. Do I? Mrs. Adler left at that point. Whether she believed the lies Danielle had invented really didn't matter. There was now this little seed of doubt. Nothing Joanne's dad could say could squash it. There was no block party at the beginning of May this year. The Adlers made up some excuse. Mr. Adler and Mr. Robinson no longer carry lumber or build anything or sit and have a beer together. Mrs. Robertson and Mrs. Adler don't play tennis anymore. For a while, the Robinsons and Adlers would nod or lift a hand to acknowledge one another. Now, Joanne says, they don't even talk.